Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful to come here together again to study and examine the foundation of this message, especially today as we look at the time of the end in our time and the events that have begun this line for us that we have used as a foundational anchor. We just ask, Lord, that as we look at these things, that anything that's unclear can be made clear. Anything that needs to be corrected can be corrected. But we know, Lord, that you are leading, and we just ask for your Holy Spirit to continue to do that work in our personal lives and in this movement. Thank you for hearing our prayer, and we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. So good morning, everyone. This is the May 1996 Our Firm Foundation article that Jeff wrote that became part of the Time of the End magazine. And again, they got this disclaimer, which I still find odd that they have to put it every time he has an article. And it's sort of a rather oblique disclaimer because they're not explicitly saying we don't agree, but it's implied. And of course, we know that Ron Spear, who was the head of Hope International, he's the one wanting Jeff's articles published in 1996. But yet people on that editorial board, many of them didn't. So I just, every time I see it, it always kind of amazes me, the opposition that was happening from something that really should seem very obvious. But it's not obvious to everyone. I did read recently an attack against what Jeff was teaching regarding the time of the end and Daniel 11, verse 40. I can't remember where I was reading it. I think it was actually an article in academia. Iran says they always refer to Acts 17:11. What are you referring to there, Iran? Acts 17:11. Who's they?
Is it possible the editors?
The editor's remarks. I was probably on mute.
Okay, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it was in like the previous articles as well.
Okay, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so. And of course, 17 times 11 is 187. So yeah, interesting point there. Yeah, I see there. Okay, now I see what you're talking about. Yeah, Acts 17:11. Yeah, so we got to see July 18th, 2020. I mean, that's the thing that we have to refer to. Very interesting observation there. Now, so this is relating to the time of the end. Now, back in 1989, as I've mentioned many times, I had studied Louis F. Weir. I remember telling my dad that the Soviet Union was going to fall based upon Louis F. Weir's understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40. And so when it fell, I recognized it as a fulfillment of prophecy, but I didn't recognize it as the time of the end. So this is something that God showed Jeff, that it referred to the time of the end for our line. And that's because he had the concept of line upon line, where Louis F. Weir didn't. He would just see that 1798's at the time of the end. He wouldn't see the response as also marking a time of the end. But that's what our movement has. That's the position that we've taken. So, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Daniel 11, verse 40. Previously, we identified the time of the end as 1798. We noted that throughout Daniel 11, the power which controlled or did the spiritual work of Egypt was the king of the south, and the power controlling or doing the work of Babylon was the king of the north. In 1798, the power which controlled the spiritual characteristics of Egypt, according to Revelation 7 or 11, verse 7 to 11, and the Great Controversy 269 to 270, was France. And at that same point in history, the power which controlled the spiritual characteristics of Babylon was the papacy, according to Revelation 17, 1 to 6, and Great Controversy 382. We found that the word push in the first part of Daniel 11:40 means to war against. When Napoleon had the Pope of Rome taken captive in 1798, the first clause of verse 40 was fulfilled, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. We will now take up the rest of this verse. The next portion of the verse predicts that the king of the north would come against the king of the south like a whirlwind, implying a counterattack at some future point. However, not simply a counterattack, but a mighty reversal of this war as represented. For in the final words of the verse, the king of the north shall overflow and pass over. We will see below the word whirlwind means to take away fearfully like a storm. And this word is placed with the word against, illustrating not only a powerful sweeping away, but also an ascendancy. The final clause of the verse represents that the king of the north will overrun and remove the southern kingdom, for to overflow is to conquer, rush, or wash away, and to pass over is to cross over or to overrun. Now, we already addressed this, that this overflowing, when it came to Judah in Isaiah chapter 8, it only came to the neck. And we recently, within the last few years, came to understand that the Soviet Union may have been destroyed, but Russia, which was the head, survived. So he's going to look at Strong's dictionary on these words, the various words here that are used. So the whirlwind is Hebrew number 8175. It's a primary root to storm, by implication to shiver, fear, be afraid, fear hurl as a storm, be tempestuous, come like, take away as with a whirlwind. And against, the 5921, it's the same as 5920, used as a preposition in the singular or plural, often with a prefix, or as in a conjugation with a particle following above, over, upon, against. He makes this connection with 5927, means to ascend, intransitively, be high, to actively mount. Now, I wouldn't quite agree with him on what he's doing with these words. So he's connecting or chaining together some words that are somewhat related. And so he's trying to say that this whirlwind also means to ascend. I'm not quite sure that I follow how he's using the Hebrew. So it's not really the same word, as even though they're related. And then the word overflow, 7857, a primary root.
Theodore,
Yeah.
at least in desert whirlwinds, they tend to pick up loose things, throw them up in the air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I understand that. And I understand sort of the idea of it. So I'm not against the idea. I'm just saying that I wouldn't personally do that with the Hebrew word. That is, I'm not going to look at all the different connections
Aaron, I thought
of a
too.
word and then say, well, the word then thus means this. But to come like or take away as a whirlwind, if we're going to apply it to what happened in 1989, the way that he's taking this as we're going to see, has to do with in taking away the USSR, it's helping the papacy ascend to the throne of the earth. I think that's the idea that he has here. And I don't know if that's how I would have looked at what happened.
Aaron had a thought on the chat.
Yeah, okay. Elijah ascended in a whirlwind. Yeah. So we know that this can happen. I'm just saying I wouldn't use the Hebrew that way, but it's still the right idea, right? So it's, I guess I'm just picky when it comes to how people use Hebrew words in Strong's Concordance. That's probably all it is. I just see people do strange things all the time by looking at these words connected together in a chain and then saying, well, this is what it means. But a whirlwind does ascend, right? I mean, if you think about it, it is lifting things up. Okay. And then overflow 7857, a primary route to gush, by implication to inundate, cleanse, by analogy to gallop or conquer. And then pass 5674, a primary route to cross over, used very widely of any transition, specifically to cover. So he's looked at these words in the Strongs, and then he's going to make an application of this. Verse 40 teaches that sometime after 1798, the northern king would sweep away the southern kingdom, or the southern king, in a very powerful fashion, while also ascending in some sense. In previous articles, we have suggested that Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, is a prophecy which was designed by God to be a catalyst for his people, awakening at the end of the world. We propose that as a parallel to the Millerite movement, we should expect to see repeated some of the events which transpired under the pioneer movement. We referred specifically to Josiah Litch's prophecy of the fall of the Ottoman Empire as an illustration of what impact the fulfillment of prophecy has on God's people and the world. So we see, and what he's going to try to look at is this event that becomes this catalyst. So for what he has at this point in 1996 is a parallel to Josiah Litch's prophecy of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But what event is he matching it with back in 1996? What does he see as a parallel of the empowerment of the first angel's message? Okay, let's read the next paragraph. In
The
connection,
fall of the Soviet Union.
yeah, so, and we wouldn't do that now, right? We would see that as the time of the end, the arrival of the first angel, but not the empowerment of the first angel. But again, he doesn't have 9/11 yet. In connection with that historic event and the prediction that some of the experiences of the pioneer movement will be repeated, we suggested that the recent fall of the Soviet Union was a possible modern counterpart of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, with the exception that this prophecy lacked the element of specific prophetic time, and so God's people were not benefited by an advanced public prediction of the event. This proposition raises the question, how did the King of the South begin as France and then become the Soviet Union? Now, I tried to understand how this raises the question, because to me it doesn't, but let's look at what he's saying. So he's looking back at Millerite history, and he's seeing that there's a fall of an empire. In Millerite history, what empire fell?
Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so what is the Ottoman Empire in Millerite history? What is it?
Islam.
Okay, it's Islam. That's not what I'm asking. Now, I'm asking this question for a reason, because when we look at
They were very afraid of it.
what's that?
They were very afraid of it,
Okay, they're
the
very,
Millerites.
yeah. So what I'm trying to get at is that when people look at this history, and especially when they try to compare it with Daniel 11, verse 40, what Uriah Smith saw is that the Ottoman Empire was the king of the north. And so what did the Millerites see with the fall of the Ottoman Empire? And this is an important point, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to attach an understanding in our history with an understanding in Millerite history. And that understanding is only partial. In Millerite history, who was the king of the north in Daniel 11, verse 40?
Rome.
In Millerite history, no. They had it as the Ottoman Empire. So in Daniel 11, verse 40, because the understanding that Uriah Smith presents is the understanding of Litch. And Litch's understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40, places the king of the north in Daniel 11:40 as Turkey, right? That was the understanding. It was the Ottoman Empire. And that's why they attached the close of probation to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, because they were using Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 and 12, verse 1. And
The way I
yeah,
was going to say, the way I understand the Millerite thought was that when the Ottoman Empire fell, it was like a lid keeping a cap on Egypt, the Islam of Egypt, and they were afraid the Islam of Egypt would come boiling out of their pot and overwhelm the whole world. That's I understood it.
okay. And maybe we need to go back and look really carefully at what Litch was teaching and the Millerites were teaching, because they did understand the papacy, but the view that Uriah Smith presents is not Uriah Smith's view when he deals with Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. He's actually presenting Litch's view. And now I said that Litch had depended a lot on Alexander Keith. There's actually another commentator, and I can't remember his name, that he was also depending upon. So, to go back there, I think we're going to have to go back there at some point in these studies. I'm going to spend a bit of time researching it and come back to present clearly what the Millerites understood. But it was not the same view that the Adventists had after 1844. That is, what James White came to understand about Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 was not the Millerite view. It was a different view. And that's part of the problem that we have here, is that many people who go back to Millerite history, they look not at what Uriah Smith is just saying, they look at what Josiah Litch is saying. And since Josiah Litch is a pioneer, they adopt that view. And this was a tricky thing, because Parminder tried to introduce that as being correct. And it's not a correct view. And the reason it's not correct is because of proximity. They were making an error, not being able to see what we now can see. So we believe that James White's interpretation was correct, and that Jeff, in continuing with that interpretation, which also we see was promoted by Lewis F. Weir. So Lewis F. Weir was very, that was one of the main points that he was making, that Uriah Smith was wrong, and that the understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40 would be correct in what James White was teaching, not what Uriah Smith was teaching. But Uriah Smith was teaching the pioneer view. Even though he wasn't a pioneer, he was just reiterating what Josiah Litch had taught. So when it comes to,
Here,
what's that?
I was going to say that Islam continued to
Okay, your sentence was garbled. So,
Okay, as a point,
okay,
um, the way that I'm looking at this in this conversation is James White reiterated but expanded upon the points that Miller had made. Uriah Smith was, while he may have been expanding or reiterating what the points that Litch had made, he was also using other sources that he felt were more accurate than those that Miller had used to refer to.
yeah, and that's what I need to research, because in my little bit of research that I've done on it, I don't think that that's quite correct.
Okay.
So I don't see that we have evidence, at least as far as I've seen yet, that Miller understood Daniel 11 verse 40, or we don't see an exposition of it, where he's going to have the king of the north being the papacy and the king of the south being France, right? But we do see Litch's interpretation, where it's quite clear that France is actually this third power, and the king of the south is Egypt, and the king of the north is Turkey. So what Uriah Smith presents is not even his own ideas. He's just stating what Josiah Litch had said, and the people that Josiah Litch was also quoting, which part of it is Alexander Keith, but Alexander Keith had some different views as well. So I'm trying to sort through that right now. I have to spend some more time studying it. But the impression that I always had is that James White was presenting the Millerite view and that Uriah Smith had introduced something new. But the reason why I think this is an important point, it's not just to get things correct. I think there is a parallel to some degree by the misunderstanding of the Millerites. Maybe a parallel isn't the right word, but we do have a misunderstanding that's happening even within this movement, that we recognize that when the Soviet Union fell, we thought that that was the end of the Soviet Union. And so I haven't come to a conclusion yet, because I have to do more research. But when it says, in connection with that historic event and the prediction that some of the experiences of the pioneer movement will be repeated, well, we need to say, what were the experiences of the pioneer movement in regard to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, and 12, verse 1. And we know that Miller, Litch, and Himes all believed that when the Ottoman Empire fell, that was the close of probation. So they believed that was an event connected with the close of probation, which we wouldn't see that now as being an event connected with the close of probation, because we interpret Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 and 12, verse 1 differently. And this to me is a new idea. The idea only came yesterday. Okay, what?
I got last time. The Eastern question years.
Yeah, so we have the Eastern question. Yeah, you're kind of garbled, so I have a hard time. All I heard was the Eastern question in Turkey. So, but if you remember the events in the news back in the 1840s, and even in the 1830s, was about this war that was going on between Egypt and Turkey, right? So there's this war going on, and we know that Turkey is falling, and there's this concern about Islam, because Turkey, they have somewhat of control over it. That is, the Western powers, they're connected with Turkey economically and politically, and they're propping Turkey up to protect against Egypt, the threat that Egypt might pose, or that Islam is going to pose to the West. And so Turkey is like a barrier. It's something that's more predictable. At least that's the way that I understand it. but I'm not an expert on this history. I've read a lot of it, but there's a lot more that I haven't read. And this war had started long before, so that's in, through the first half of the 1800s that you see this going on, and even later on. So Uriah Smith, all these people, because we don't actually have Turkey fall in the sense that the Ottoman Empire has fallen until the 1920s. So and so it happens in stages. But this point that fulfilled the prophecy, the end of the Second Woe, did occur on August 11th, 1840, because it fulfills those conditions. Am I making it clear, though, what I think the problem is here, or the issue that we have to address in looking at Millerite history and our history? Are people getting what I'm talking about?
You're saying that the misunderstanding of the Ottoman Empire is paralleled in our history. That's what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah, the issue of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, even though we had an understanding of it that Jeff had, that is essentially correct, we did recognize that we saw that the Soviet Union falling was the end of that issue. But now we've taken the position that Russia still is the head, and that even though the Soviet Union fell, we're not going to move the King of the South to China. We're not going to move it to something else. We're going to keep it as Russia. That's the position that this movement has taken. Because Russia still was the head.
Does that
of the
make
Soviet Union.
Russia to the Eastern question?
Is that what to the Eastern question?
Through, does that make Russia to the East right now?
Okay, you're kind of garbled.
People
So
are still today.
okay, yeah, I can't hear what you're saying.
Bad connection.
Yeah, it's a bad
The
connection.
parallel the Eastern question.
Okay, type it in.
Russia
Can you
with
type it in the chat?
the head.
Pat, can you type it in the chat?
Oh,
I can't grasp what you're saying.
Oh.
I just know that it's a question about Russia and the Eastern question. So if you type it in the chat, then we can address it. We're just going to go on and read here. We'll come back to this point again. Throughout the ebb and flow of history, as marked out in Daniel 11, the kings of the north and south rose and fell as new powers emerged to overthrow the previous kingdoms. After 1798, the crown of the south also changed hands. France wore the crown of the king of the south in 1798 as it manifested the spiritual characteristics of Egypt, atheism. Yet after the French Revolution, the philosophy of atheism began to grow and refine, while the government of France moved away from atheism as the fundamental principle of its philosophy of government. We sort of discussed this a bit yesterday. Beginning in the seedbed of France, atheism eventually spread across Europe and even the whole world. Through growing in its intellectual influence, atheism had ceased to have a voice, for to have a voice prophetically requires a government. The speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities, the Great Controversy 442. The king of the south is not seen again until another nation fulfills the qualifications necessary to assume the crown. Through exalting and incorporating the characteristics of atheism into their government. So what he's saying here is that France is the voice for atheism in the French Revolution. But as it moves away from atheism, atheism spreads throughout the world, but it's not speaking in that sense until it has a government behind it. And that's when the USSR comes into play, because it now becomes this atheistic power that replaces the France, because it now has the characteristics. And the question, of course, one of the questions we have to address is, when the Soviet Union fell and Russia remained, did Russia still remain to be the king of the South, or did those characteristics move somewhere else? Now, I've taken the position in the past, and I still hold to that position, that prophetically, Russia is still maintaining that symbol because it was the head of the USSR. And even though Russia is not now atheistic, it's still going to take upon that role because it's a continuation of that conflict that we saw happening in Daniel 11, verse 40. It's a continuation of that by a repeat of history of the rest of the history of Daniel chapter 11. So all these battles of the kings of the north and the king of the south are telling us about the history that's coming now. That's the position our movement took. That's the position Jeff took. And that's the position I still hold to, unless we had some other reason to change that position. But I'm not going to just change that position just because, November 9th and July 18th didn't happen the way we expected. And when I think about it, what happened with the division that happened in this movement, on December 6th, I haven't had any contact really with that part of our movement, with FFA, but I already saw the seeds in that movement that would undo this understanding that Jeff had. And so I don't know where those people are going individually, but I would think that the logical conclusion when you rejected July 18th is you would go back and reject all of this foundational understanding that Jeff is presenting here. And you would also reject his understanding regarding Russia being the king of the South still. So that's one of the reasons I'm not so ready to do that, is because I see that that's the direction that the other part of the movement would logically take.
Well, at this point, they haven't gone back that far yet.
Yeah, well, are they doing anything right now that you know of, Pat?
Started off at verse 1 of Daniel 11 again and trying to, see where they went off track.
And is it still Guy?
Well,
Yep.
we're comparing what we said about Raffia and Panium now. The Diadochi War is looking in that stuff.
Yeah, so is it Guy still leading out?
Yes.
Yeah. So I can't see anything good coming from that, as far as they're going to have to unravel everything. Because what Guy's already done, he's the one really who's led out in unraveling Jeff's position. So they're going to come to completely different conclusions with Guy leading out. But I mean, that's something they have to worry about, I guess. So the question is, can we parallel the current fear of Russia with the Millerite fear of the Eastern question? And I would say no. That's not how I'm understanding it. Anybody else have a thought on that? What Pat is asking there. Iran says they deleted about the last 20 videos Jeff put out. And so those would have been all the videos on Daniel chapter 11. Correct? Yeah.
The His Hand Removed series.
It was Daniel's last vision, I think, is what it was called. But
Daniel's last vision. Yeah. So if you take away Daniel's last vision, if you start removing those videos from Jeff, and that to me just seems pretty bizarre that they're going to remove. I mean, I don't like, to me, it's kind of like revisionism. History is what it is. And when you start removing things, I never liked it even when they removed Parminder's and Tessa's stuff, because one is, that's history. It's something that happened. And I would think that we would want to know that in order to be able to me, it'd be like going back for the Adventist Church to go back and start removing books and articles of things we no longer agree with. It's always just striked me as revisionism, and it doesn't allow us to see how things have changed and grown, and how our understanding has changed. So we have no way to check our present understanding if we don't know what we taught in the past. We can't see where it's drifted. But that's my view. I mean, I know Jeff was involved in removing videos as well, and I never really agreed with that. Anyway, we have this idea of this parallel of the current fear of Russia. I don't have a fear of Russia, so I'm not really quite sure what that would mean, with the Millerite fear of the Eastern question. And I don't know if there's a Millerite fear of the Eastern question either. So not sure what that would be. I just knew that they believed that the Eastern question was related to prophecy. And of course it was, because August 11th, 1840 is connected with the Eastern question. They believed that the fall of Turkey was an event that was going to lead to the second coming. In our history, if we wanted to make a parallel, we could say that the fall of the Soviet Union was going to lead to the Sunday Law. But we came to understand that the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't the end of the issue, as Jeff is looking at it here in 1996. Anybody with thoughts on that?
That's what I was thinking, that August 11th, 1840 was not the end of the issue for them.
Yeah, they were looking at the marshaling of the nations. There was a bunch, and the angering of the nations. And this is something we don't really relate to. That is, if you go back and read Millerite history, there's parts of it that seem kind of, for us, unfamiliar. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that there was this war going on with Turkey and Egypt. That was really the big news of the day, because that was the conflict that was going on. So when Josiah Litch made his prediction, it wasn't about some obscure event. It's something that was really the discussion, the political discussion of the day. What's going on with Turkey? So this Eastern question still continued to be an issue even after 1844. So what's that?
One of the points, one of the concepts that was available at that time but not well understood was brought out very clearly by Lewis Weir, and that Jeff has espoused multiple times, that before the cross, literal; after the cross, figurative or spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
The issue that you have when you go back into some of the writings of Josiah Litch, especially his 1841 address to the public and especially the clergy, is that he applies a very literal view to all of this in Daniel 11. And he does not have a spiritual or figurative viewpoint. He just chooses to accept a literal king of the north and a literal king of the south. So our situation here, as we are addressing this, is we have to look at this again through the lens that first was promoted by Weir, but was heartily seconded by Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to take a look at this in a spiritual aspect and not so much as a literal aspect.
Right. And this is the thing that I'm struggling with, because when I look at what happened on November 9th, or what we were predicting on November 9th, because we had seen that we were now going to apply the history of Daniel 11, and we were going to apply it to our history. And the way that we were going to apply it is we had seen that 1989 was this water flowing up and coming up to the neck, right? And so you had the fall of the Soviet Union, and we had thought it was the end. But now we have to address, how is the king of the Battle of the King of the North and the King of the South expressed in our history? Now, the way that we took it was this was going to be a war between the United States and Russia. Now, I said, I haven't changed that position because I haven't had good reason, but I'm starting to examine it and thinking that it could have been that was part of our problem, is that we didn't fully understand it. Maybe we were applying some things too literally as far as a repeat of history. And so, and this is just a new idea to me from yesterday. So, I don't want to make a lot of bold statements about it. But one of the things that we saw from yesterday is this idea that the battle may have moved in a different way than we expected. Now, when it comes to atheism, some people are just saying, well, we're going to move it now to China, which I don't see as an option, because I don't think that China has that role prophetically. And this would be quite a divergence from what we saw in our lines. We would actually have to reinterpret quite a bit. But one idea, at least to think about, is that, have we seen atheism rise worldwide since the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Yeah, we have.
Most definitely.
Yeah. And so much so, I mean, and people who weren't alive in 1989 might not realize this, but back in 1989, if you were an atheist, you were completely marginalized. You would not have been. I'm getting some very strange sounds here in this recording. Not sure, might be. I think it was you, Ryan. I just muted you. So to be an atheist you would be marginalized. You wouldn't be taken seriously in 1989. Maybe in some of the scientific community you might have been, but just in the public domain, atheism wasn't cool, and it just wasn't common. It existed, of course, in Hollywood and different places here and there, but it was really, to a large degree, underground. But we saw a change happen, and that change, of course, happened for lots of different reasons. But we see really a very secular society today, and you can see politicians being openly opposed to God, which you could not have seen in 1989, because nobody would ever be elected in the United States, at least, but even other places. You had to be a theist, but that has changed. So the atheism has been on the rise. Now the question is, what Jeff is saying is that atheism needed to have a voice. Does atheism still have to have a voice after what happened in 1989? Does it have to be a nation, or can it be the nations or the United Nations that now takes upon that role?
Yeah, I would say that the UN is, or not just the UN, but all these supranational organizations are the voice of atheism today.
Okay, yeah, and so that's the suggestion I have. Now I'm not settled on it. Like, I wouldn't just say we were wrong about Russia, and now we need to look at the King of the South as being these nations connected internationally. But we see, one of the things that we saw happen, did we see a battle between if that was the case? So right now we're just speculating, but would we have seen a battle between the King of the North and the King of the South that has been acted out if atheism is not Russia and how we described it? And have we seen that battle being waged? And the King of the North, who would the King of the North be then in that case? That would be the United States. Have we seen the United States having a battle between atheism, not in the character of Russia, but in the character of these international organizations?
Well, specifically, I would say that the King of the North is the Republican Party.
Okay, the King of the North is the Republican Party. Okay, and then the King of the South would be the Democrats?
Yes, because
Okay.
they are the United States manifestation of the globalists.
Okay, so maybe this is a possibility, because all we know is that we have a repeat of history of Daniel chapter 11 that we are now placing after 1989. And maybe, this is just a suggestion, I'm not saying I buy into this view, but maybe we were looking in the wrong place. Instead of Russia being the head, could atheism have been the head? That when it came up to the neck, it destroyed the USSR. But it's not so much that Russia is the head, but that atheism is the head, or communism is the head.
Well, what I taught for years was that the King of the South was dead and there was no opposition to Rome rising to control the world. And so that was my point of reference. Who is opposing Rome? We don't have any opposition to Rome now.
Yeah, so, and you mentioned that before.
Because one of the reasons I've been so open to different theories like China or the one we're talking about right now is because I've done a lot of research on Russia the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been essentially reduced to just a crony capitalist Wild West. Like it's not really a formidable opponent anymore in any regard.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there. But that was, of course, one of the points that was initially made regarding Raffia, is that it might be some kind of, this power that's just been weakened, somehow making a strike against the United States, either is in some kind of hot war or maybe a cyber war. So that was kind of the initial idea. But I am open to the idea that we were wrong to some degree, and Jeff was right that we were wrong, but he wasn't right about what we were completely wrong about, if that makes any sense. That is,
Makes sense.
Yeah, that we had a right idea, but we were now taking it too literally and trying to look at it as a battle between Russia and the United States, where it was going to move into a realm that was different. Wasn't going to be a military confrontation.
And one thing I've been thinking about is a Joe Biden victory in the 2020 election not a possible raffia? Because nobody saw that coming.
Well,
nobody in their right mind saw it coming.
No. I think even people in their wrong mind didn't see it coming. They just hoped that it would come. Right? People really thought Trump was going to win, in spite of all the media's bravado and so forth. But that was just to try to manipulate voters. I don't think really people saw that Trump was going to lose that election. But anyway, those are things to think about. We're going to go back here and continue reading and try to see how this relates to what we're talking about. It is interesting to note that one characteristic of atheism's work as a force in the history of nations is that it was always accompanied by revolution, Beginning with the French Revolution, atheism placed the palace of the King of the South in France. However, by 1917, atheism moved the palace of the Southern King to Russia in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1917, the King of the South came out of exile and continued its ongoing battle against the forces of Catholicism. Sister White implies that these principles of atheism would continue and reach a higher state of importance than simply the French Revolution. The centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the encircling of the few, the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poorer classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. So if you take this statement,
That's just what we were saying.
yeah, it's just what we were saying. And it's written here in 1996. And do we see that communism and socialism is on the rise, not just worldwide, but specifically in the United States, in a place we would never expect it to happen?
Yeah, it's global now. Global
Yeah,
atheism rising up.
yeah, and it's in the United States. So that point that we're seeing that this. So what Ellen White is saying is that atheism is moving worldwide. So we saw it move from France to Russia, and then the Soviet Union, right? But with the Soviet Union falling, it wasn't the death of atheism. So this is just an idea, but it seems to be consistent with what Jeff is saying in 1996. Tracing the history of the Soviet Union.
So when I was when I was saying the King of the South was dead, that's wrong. It's just spread worldwide now.
Yeah. Tracing the history of the Soviet Union's conquests through the following years is enlightening in many ways. First is the fact that as country after country came under the control of his kingdom, the primary mode to accomplish such a feat was revolution. The design of communism was to infiltrate, indoctrinate, and bring about a revolution. Another aspect of this growth is that almost all the countries which were eventually brought under the umbrella of the Soviet Union had previously been Catholic-dominated nations. One by one, Catholicism was losing its power base. As communism's revolution spread throughout the world, the papacy was provided with a tool to identify the Soviet Union as a common enemy of themselves and the United States. This common enemy ploy prepared the way for the alliance described in verse 40, which is also the alliance more broadly addressed in Revelation 13. Verse 40 teaches that the king of the north would eventually sweep the king of the south away with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. Identifying these prophetic symbols points to the role of the United States in this war. So, a lot of this we are familiar with. The mode in which the Soviet Union fell, and basically the confederacy between the United States and the papacy by having this common enemy ploy, right, that the Pope had introduced. We understand that chariots and horsemen are symbolic of military power in Bible prophecy. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king, and he prepared him chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. 1 Kings 1:5. And Ben-Hadad, the king of Assyria, gathered all his hosts together, and there were 32 kings with him, and horses and chariots. And he went up and besieged Samaria and warred against it. 1 Kings 21. Ships are often associated with economic strength in Bible prophecy. They that go down to the sea in ships and that do business in great waters. Psalms 107:23. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off and cried. Alas, alas, that great city wherein made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness, right? So it's a very common idea. We know that ships represent economic power. The king of the north, the papacy, was grieved when it lost its political power in 1798. In Daniel 11:30, the emperors of the Roman Empire had been grieved by their inability to resist the onslaught of the three horns of Daniel 7, representing the Goths, Vandals, and the Heruli. France became the first Catholic nation when its king, Clovis, dedicated his nation to removing these three horns. The recent historical record describing the fall of the Soviet Union echoes the history of Clovis as it identifies the military and economic pressure supplied by the United States coming to the aid of the papacy to sweep away the Southern king. So he's just taking past histories, paralleling the history of Clovis and paralleling it again. We're giving the army of France to the papacy to set it upon the throne of the earth. And in 1989, the United States is taking that role. So what role is the United States taking in 1989 when it combines with the papacy? How would we describe that role?
King of the
Arms
South.
coming to his part. Was that arm standing on his part?
Okay, arm standing is part. So historically, what role is that? Somebody else had a comment?
King of the South.
Okay, so the question is it the king of the South? Now, and that's kind of the thing that I want to look at. Is France the king of the South in 538?
I would say no.
I would say no too. So what is France?
Well, if you want to tie this into Revelation,
Yeah.
it's the beast that's being ridden by the woman. It's the you don't understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I understand what you're saying. So the woman rides a beast. Now we see that happening in let's go here. I'm just gonna
Jeff would say that France was the power that changes, and the United States also changes.
Okay. Yeah. And
So they're parallel.
yes, so they have to do with their changeable nature. So France is going to, it's different powers at different times. Just because it's France doesn't mean it's always the same. And France and the United States, how are they connected?
Two-part powers.
Okay, how is France a two-part power?
It was Sodom and Egypt.
Okay, right. So it's Sodom and Egypt. And the United States? What are its two parts?
Republicanism and Protestantism.
Right. So they're in a sense
Republicanism and Protestantism.
Yeah. Okay. So
Right.
if we go to let's go to Revelation here. I have some problems with my. What's going on here? I can't get my bar out of the way here. I'll leave it over here. There. So remember, we have these beasts. We have the dragon in Revelation chapter 12. And this dragon is this great red dragon. What is this great red dragon in chapter 12? What is it representing?
Rome, pagan Rome.
Okay, primarily it's Satan, but secondarily it's pagan Rome. And
Yeah.
You know, and I've brought out before in different studies that when you look at the heads and the horns and the crowns, where are the crowns in chapter 12? And how many crowns are there?
There's 10 crowns.
There's 7 crowns in chapter 12 and upon the 7 heads, right? So there's 10 horns, but there's 7 crowns. So these beasts are not the same. If you look in chapter 13, horns, crowns, heads, what do we see?
Yeah, the crowns are on the head.
The crowns are on the horns rather than the heads.
Right. So now you have 10 crowns on the 10 horns. So it's different. Again, it's a different period of time that's being addressed because it's different. It's a different beast, even though it's related. The symbols are related. And then in chapter 17, this is the one with the woman riding the beast. So you have the woman riding the beast. Now we know that the beast is what? What was the beast? We saw the beast in chapter 12. We saw it in chapter 13. What is this beast?
Rome.
Okay, well, it's Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. It's the nations of the world. But it in different periods of time, it's manifesting in different aspect. Pagan Rome, papal Rome. But now here, we have these 7 heads, 10 horns. Where are the crowns?
There are none.
There aren't any. And why is that?
It's not referring to monarchies.
Okay. So, well, okay, it's not referring to monarchies. That could be.
Well, the woman is in control now. She's wearing the crown.
Okay. Let me see here.
That's verse 5. She has this name written on her crown.
On her forehead. Upon her forehead. Well, it could be a crown.
We speak of the forehead as the crown of the head often.
Yeah, that's true. And I was just trying to look for the verse here. So if you look at verse 9 and 10, there are 7 kings. So I would say they're kings, and so this has to do with monarchies, if you want to put it that way. 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. So it's Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome, Rome, both pagan and papal. The one that is the United States. The other one that's not yet come is the UN. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. And the beast which that was and is not, that's the papacy, even he is the 8th and is of the 7. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So why is it that they don't have crowns? According to this verse.
Yeah, that's
Haven't
when they
received the
get
kingdom
their
yet.
crowns.
Yeah, they haven't received a kingdom yet. That's the way that I understand this. Whether I'm correct or not, I don't know. But my view has always been that when you look at the crowns and that there is no crowns, this is referring to a time prior to the UN. That is, prior to the UN coming in power. So the United States is the power that's presently ruling. So this is from 1798 to the Sunday Law. Is that how you would see it? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, interesting that the head rules but doesn't have a crown on it until the 10 come up.
Yeah. Okay, Angela asks, may not a crown also can indicate individual nations' sovereignty distinction as opposed to melding into universal hegemonious power?
Sounds good.
I don't know if the way that I take it is that they don't have a crown yet, because they are kings, right? So they are monarchy in that sense. They're being symbolized by words that we would consider to be monarchy. They're rulers. It doesn't really matter what kind of ruler. Though we do know that the United States is different. The United States is a republic, and it has two horns to separate the church and state, republicanism and Protestantism, that are separate. So during the time that the United States is ruling, this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns that the woman's riding upon doesn't have crowns, but it's going to have crowns. That is, the United Nations is going to rule the world again, or this, which is Rome. Rome is going to rule the world through the UN. That's the understanding we've always had, that Rome once again will be sitting upon the throne of the earth, with the military and political power under it being the United Nations. Would people agree with me on that? Or would there somebody?
Sounds good. And the United States would be the first king of the United Nations, like Ahab was the king of the 10 northern tribes.
Yeah, possibly. Anybody going to disagree?
No.
Well, somebody's got to disagree. And if people have a different idea, if I'm going wrong on this, I want to know. That's the point that I'm making.
Well, none of us will disagree.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let me go back. Yeah, and I really think that we have to go back over this history of what happened to this. Just hang on a sec. That's not what I want. There we go. Because we're not going to get through this article today, but what I'm going to do tomorrow, so we're going to read a little bit more. But what I really want to do tomorrow is I'm going to go back and look at how Miller and Litch and Himes, how they understood Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So I'm going to try to dig that up for tomorrow, because the point that we're seeing here is that Jeff is actually suggesting something different by the quotes he's using that I don't think he's fully applying correctly. That is, he's seeing that the USSR is the fulfillment of this statement of Ellen White regarding the rise of atheism. So when she says here in Education 228, the centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poor classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. What event is she pointing to, according to Jeff?
Socialism.
But it's the rise of the USSR.
Yeah.
So Jeff is taking this statement and he's saying what happened in France. Ellen White says that's going to happen again. And then when Jeff reads the statement, he says, well, this is speaking about the USSR. But when we read this statement, what do we see?
We see it applied to our own time.
And we see it applied to who?
To the United States.
to the United States, right? Jeff didn't see that in 1996. I wouldn't have seen it in 1996. I don't think any of us could even really have imagined what we've seen happen in this last year. Even a couple of years ago, we wouldn't have seen the events as they've unfolded in the United States. And it's just very peculiar. Now, an example of this is they started that George Floyd trial. And I happened to go to the doctor's yesterday. I had this thing on my face that they did some stuff with. They had a TV there, and they had Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, that's the government television media in Canada. And the trial, the way they titled it wasn't, it was the George Floyd killing trial. They've already decided that it was a killing, that George Floyd didn't die from a drug overdose. And what does that tell you about what's happening? And you read people's comments, if you go on YouTube and read things about the trial, you're going to see that people are extremely divided on this point, whether George Floyd was actually murdered, killed, or whether he died of a drug overdose. And why is there that difference of view regarding this event?
Because the media and the people who are responsible for giving us information have taken it upon themselves to tell us what to believe.
Yeah. And it's an ideological divide, right? So the media is not objective in any of this. They're already the judge, the jury, and really to some degree the executioner. So what we see happening presently, the media doesn't even have, alleged. They don't even use the term alleged. They just take it that he is guilty, and that this trial is just a formality. Now, of course, the defense lawyers, have a much different story, and I tend to believe that story because it accords with the facts. Even though when you look at the scene initially, it appears that he died because there was a knee to his neck. But when you look at the whole story, you realize that that's not really possible. And that's not what the autopsy says. So, but you have the media on the one hand with an ideological driven narrative of everything that's happening around us. And that ideology is globalism, it's anti-American, it's anti-God, it's socialist, it's communist. And we didn't expect that to happen. At least I didn't. I never really thought that the enemy was socialism. And why didn't I think that? Well, one is I didn't really understand how the Catholic Church is socialist. So what you're seeing happening that appears to be an atheistic movement of socialism and atheism is actually to a large degree the result of the Catholic Church being behind it. And that seems sort of counterintuitive from how I used to think. And the way that we as Adventists would always look at it is that the enemy would be the evangelical Christians. But in studying the joining of the two sticks that we did when we studied the book of Ezekiel, we see that Protestants are actually going to join with us at the Sunday law. Now, not all Protestants, but many Protestants will. And a lot of Protestants, though, they're going to be globalists, because we even see that happening with Adventism. Adventism is buying into the Black Lives Matter and a lot of this socialist agenda and identity politics and so forth. So, the battle what's happening, the end time events are unfolding differently than we thought. Now, the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves, are we going to have the same problem of perspective or magnification that the Millerites had, and even that people had in Adventism, at the turn of the century into the 1900s and so forth? Are we going to be able to somehow see through external events and understand what the scriptures are telling us that we need to do to get prepared? Because I think the problem, and I remember when we before Trump was elected, on Facebook, I was obviously opposed to Trump, like not politically, but just from a moral and religious point of view. I mean, I never liked Trump before or anything. Had no interest in the guy. He just seemed like a blowhard. And this idea of him, if he became the president of the United States, is that you would have somebody who would bring in the Sunday law. That's sort of the impression that I had. He would be this guy who would be a dictator. But as things unfolded, and I looked at the actual situation that was happening, and I listened to what Trump was actually saying, and I realized that the media had completely distorted the situation. That is, what we were seeing, the Trump that we were seeing in the media, was partly an invention of Trump from a point of promoting himself as a businessman. But a lot of it was also an invention of the media to discredit him. So things were not as they seemed. And there were Adventists supporting Trump. And I would see these people as, people who are just going to buy into the evangelical side of things. They were going to support the Sunday law when the evangelicals brought it in. So my perspective has completely changed as far as what's actually happening in the world. And there's a lot of uncertainty of what's happening in the world and how things are going to unfold. And we had a lot of uncertainty from the time of the election till finally January 6th. There was a lot of uncertainty until that point. At that point, we knew, Trump wasn't going to be continue to be president, even though some people tried to hold on to it. But you could just see there was no way, after what happened in the siege of Washington, that you were going to have Trump become president. Nobody was going to let that happen, even if it was found, that the election was a fraud. It wasn't going to happen. So we're now in this situation where we have to sort through this. And I've kept emphasizing that the individual responsibility we have to study and understand these things is the thing that's going to help us survive the deception that's coming upon the world. And it's not as clear cut as we would like it to be. We can't just follow some group or some person and be safe. We now have to understand these things for ourselves. But I do think going back to this foundation and looking at it, not just our movement, but even Millerite history, is going to give us that insight. And of course, that's not separated from a relationship with Christ. This isn't an intellectual issue. It is one that is spiritual. Ryan, you had a comment?
No, sorry. I just had my mic on.
Okay. So I'm just going to read a little bit more here.
No, I do.
Yeah. Okay. Pat.
I'm always thinking of reverse engineering final events, because something has to create enough fear so that people will beg for a Sunday law. And so I'm always thinking, when is the big disaster going to hit that will cause so much fear that people will want a Sunday, regardless of who the president is? So I'm kind of always reverse engineering the news.
And that's the way I always did it, except now I think that the reason why we were wrong in our reverse engineering of things is that we didn't really understand the end. And so I'm taking the position right now that one thing I have always taken the position of is that the Sunday law is going to come in a way that we don't expect, that we can't anticipate. And it's going to come from areas that we never imagined, because it needs to be a worldwide. And so the idea initially was, well, something happens and everybody turns to God, but the wrong God. But I think that actually the Sunday law, from what I see now, is going to not be so much a religious Sunday law in the way that we saw it before, even though the Catholic Church will be behind it, and the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is becoming so secular. It's becoming a political power that's tied to religion, but it's abandoning much that it used to profess to believe. And so, I still don't fully understand the role of the Catholic Church in that regard.
I put a lot of stock in what Ellen White says about returning to temporal prosperity. So that's a marker for me, the loss of temporal prosperity. And it's got to be global then.
Yeah, and of course that would come about when you have communism. Now, so just dealing with here, let's just read this. I want to read this through this last little bit, and then we'll close with prayer. Tracing the history of the Soviet Union's conquest through the following years is enlightening in many ways. First is the fact that as country after country come under the control of this kingdom, the primary mode to accomplish such a feat was revolution. So Jeff focuses upon revolution, and we see that happening now. The design of communism was to infiltrate, indoctrinate, and bring about a revolution. Another aspect of this growth is that almost all the countries which were eventually brought under the umbrella of the Soviet Union had previously been Catholic-dominated nations. Now he brings up this point that Catholicism was losing its power base. And when we look at this struggle for the control of the world, we know that this struggle is between three different powers: atheism, communism, the papacy, and the United States. Those are the powers that are struggling for the control of the world. So this is something that we're going to have to think about. We're going to come back to this tomorrow. We were reading about the ships, but I'm going to still just kind of review, and then we'll finish off this article. But I'm going to first, before we come back to the article tomorrow, I'm going to try to address this issue of how the pioneers understood Daniel, chapter 11, verse 40 to 45. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we have raised many different issues here, ones that we really didn't expect as we studied this article. And we know, Lord, that there are things that we don't understand, and we ask that you can teach us and help us understand these things. We know that the foundation was laid correctly, and there are things here that Jeff didn't fully see, but we know, Lord, that that the truth is consistent with this message. And so we just ask that as we continue to study, that we can study with an open mind and a heart, and that you can give us the spirit of discernment, that we can see what is truth and what is error, and that we individually can understand these things for ourselves. Please be with each person throughout this day and bring us back together again, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.